Welcome to Conversations with Des in live stream format. I'm Des Blanchfield, your host and moderator for today's expert panel. Today, I'm going to be discussing the topic of Data Protection Day with two industry experts in this space, and let me briefly introduce them to you. I'm joined by data protection and cybersecurity expert Bill Mew. Bill spends his days reporting on the latest impact and transformations across business, technology, telecommunications, and enterprise. Bill is also the founder and CEO of an organization called Crisis Team based in London. And he's an EMEA and UK associate with ELNION.com and Social. Bill, great to have you here today. Welcome.
Great as ever to see you and Nigel. Always a delight. And I'm really interested in getting into the meat of the chat here, because privacy is not such a massive issue. It's getting bigger and bigger all the time, and the awareness is increasing. But we've just seen World Data Protection Day, and I think that marks a landmark that absolutely deserves some discussion.
Indeed. I'm also joined by enterprise data management and data protection expert Nigel Tozer from Metarista, I should get that right, the Enterprise Data Consulting Group. Nigel, likewise, great to have you here. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks, Des. I always enjoy the chats with you and Bill. Looking forward to it today.
So let me set the scene for today's discussion. In 2006, the Committee of Ministers of the Council of Europe decided to launch a Data Protection Day to be celebrated each year on the 28th of January. Data Protection Day is now celebrated globally, in fact, and is called Privacy Day in areas outside of Europe. In fact, within America, a not-for-profit called the National Cybersecurity Alliance, aka NCSA, created a local version for Data Protection Day focused on their domestic audience. In fact, this year, the NCSA expanded their annual Data Privacy Day into Data Privacy Week, which now runs from January the 24th to the 28th, to raise more awareness and help people protect themselves online, as well as hold businesses accountable when it comes to respecting user personal data. So on the 28th of January 2022, we actually celebrated the 16th edition of Data Protection Day. The right to data protection. The Council of Europe, the initiator of this important celebration, continues to play a leading role by encouraging and showcasing initiatives held on the occasion. Celebrated yearly, in fact, on the same day, Data Protection Day marks the anniversary of the opening for signature of Convention 108, the Global Data Protection Convention. In fact, 2021 was the 40th anniversary of Convention 108. For 40 years, Convention 108 has influenced and shaped the protection of privacy and data protection in Europe and beyond. In fact, its modernized version, known as Convention 108 Plus, continues to do so. And of course, the main goal of this day worldwide is, of course, to educate the public on data protection challenges and inform individuals about their rights and how to exercise them. Bill, the overarching challenge of data protection is a massive challenge, and we could run an entire full-day event on the topic and still not really scratch the surface. So when you talk about data protection in boardrooms, how do you summarize the issue in short in a couple of minutes to convey the key messages to the likes of key decision makers in government?
Data protection is something that has become top of mind since regulations have been introduced in many different countries, including GDPR in Europe and similar regulations elsewhere in the world. One of the countries that has been a little bit slow to enact similar reform has been in the US, where we have regulation in some states such as California, but no federal regulation at all. One of the things that I focus on, and I'm very well known for a lot of digital ethics and privacy campaigning, but it's not about privacy for privacy's sake. We need meaningful protection, and for it to be meaningful, it needs to include not only privacy but security, because they go hand in hand, but also meaningful and real enforcement of some of the regulations, and I think some of that's been missing. But all of this meaningful protection needs to go hand in hand with the maximization of economic and social value. We don't want to be Luddites. We don't want to shun the potential advantages of technology. And therefore, you need to get the balance right. But I would argue that at this moment in time, because of the lack of enforcement, I believe that the balance has shifted in the wrong direction, and that our privacy is at risk.
Nigel, your career has spanned a couple of decades, in fact, with a laser focus on enterprise data protection. when you talk to data protection specialists and experts in boardrooms, and particularly CEOs and the C-suite, how do you outline the topic in a couple of minutes to convey the challenges associated to that audience?
Well, unfortunately, the topic tends to get focused on the risk to the business rather than the risk to individuals. So we see a lot of discussions around the big fines that have come about because of things like GDPR. I always try and position that, though, that you've got to be with the awareness that people have around privacy now, and that is really growing, which I'm glad to say. It's better to be fair and equitable, and have a contract with whoever it is that's your customer or where your business is focused, and be fair with their data. I think we've got to the point where it's just so easy to collect data that we do it and don't think to stop to think whether we should. And of course, those fines that I mentioned nearly always come about because of things like data breaches. So I'm always really focused around, only collect the data that you need, that you're going to use, and make sure it's secured properly. And that tends to be the focus in boardrooms these days. But of course, most businesses want to be data driven, and they just, it's like a golden goose to keep chasing it. So there's a lot of education still to happen.
Indeed, and I'm constantly talking to folk in boardrooms who are still struggling to understand some of the basic concepts around this, whether it's compliance within their own organization, how they operate, whether it's compliance and regulatory requirements at state or federal level, and certainly on a global level. And what concerns me is if they don't have a vocabulary and a language with which they can discuss in the boardroom, it's very difficult to inform their organization and their staff and business partners on how they expect them to behave, and then similarly, as you said, their customers. Nigel, you've actually just authored a 3-part series of articles in the form of weekly blogs for ELNION.com around this space. So I wonder if you can give us a brief overview of what you covered and why.
Yeah, sure. Well, the first blog, and that's the only one that's out right now, but I will tell you a little bit about the others, give you a bit of a teaser trailer. But the first one really focuses on how data is collected and what are the risks to our personal freedoms if it is collected. So right now, it used to be the preservation of nation states to go do some of the AI face detection for security purposes, but that's even being used now in bricks and mortar stores by regular commercial companies, and that's a lot more invasive, for example, than just having a regular TV camera. Now, a lot of people will ask, why should I care? If it's just a computer that knows what I'm doing to serve me some ads, why does it really matter? But it's getting a lot more invasive than that these days. So it could affect the price that you pay for something online, even down to, I know a lot more of us are traveling again now. If you always get stopped at the airport, it could be some pre-crime AI that's actually picking you out because of some association, whether that's by design or by accident. And you can get stopped at the airport every time. And there's a bunch of things in between, even down to, you pass your tablet to your granny and you get some embarrassing ads served there because of your online activity. So there's a lot of things that can affect us personally. The problem is, and I just mentioned this in the last session that I spoke, and that was around, it's so easy to collect data nowadays that companies just do it. If you take companies like McDonald's, for example, they've gone from just a sticker on a card to get a free coffee. Now it's all done by an app, and they want financial information, they want to know your browsing history, and so on. And I don't want to pick on them because just about every commercial organization is doing it, but you really need all of that data. And so that how companies get that data, how they use it is a second blog. And then the third blog really just goes into some tips, tricks of what you can do to at least enhance your privacy in our modern world, because it's not easy to do. And you do kind of have to go out your way to do that these days.
Indeed, and we'll have links for our audience in the show below where to get those blogs and articles, and we're looking forward to the next in the series. And as you said, it's all well and good to have some of those controls in place, but we are literally leaking data wherever we go as we move our mobile phones, sort of logging, tracking their positions with themselves. The log data goes back to the providers, whether it's our carrier, whether it's our manufacturer, whether it's some of the software apps on there, whether it's the status of our being logged in or not within those apps, whether it's adverts running on those. The other day, something really surprised me, and I won't go into too much detail, but something happened where I looked something up online, I left that browser open on the device, went somewhere else, and next thing something was popping up, and it turned out there was a full circle close between my physical proximity, my travel, and what I looked at before I started traveling, and it happened in real time. And it just reminded me that we are literally living, breathing, leaking data. And as you said before, organizations want to be data-driven. That's the big drive we want now. We want digital transformations. We want to focus on data. Everyone's got a data lake, although sometimes they turn to data swamps. And without even intending to, just something as simple as leaving an app open and running, or a web page open on your device, you are effectively, doxing yourself in many ways. Bill, you were recently featured on broadcast television, something you're no stranger to discuss the very topic of data protection. I wonder if you can give us an outline of what you discussed on that show and some of the key points of focus, and I guess why you felt some of those topics were important for government decision makers to address in particular.
Yeah, when not enjoying a good chat with the likes of you guys, I do appear on certain international broadcast news channels. But some of the focus recently has again been around regulation. You guys have touched on some of the data abuses, the data risks. The only way a lot of this is going to change is if that we have what I described earlier as meaningful protection. And interestingly enough, whilst the US leads in a lot of the technology, it isn't actually leading in much of the regulation. GDPR is held up as the gold standard for protection and has been copied widely. But a lot of the recent initiatives have actually come from another country you may be familiar with, Des, down in Australia, where they have taken the battle to the news aggregators on behalf of some of the publishers. And I commented on that recently, and where they've also introduced rules around the sort of anonymization that we have on social media platforms, and how that shields people from taking responsibility from some of the abuse that they do as individuals, whether that's cyberbullying or whatever. We need protections not only from the big organizations that are snooping on us, but from the bullies and the other people that are having an effect on our digital presence. So all of this is central, but a little bit closer to home, I also comment on some of the implications of Brexit, because the UK, as you know, is no longer in Europe, and therefore we're going to have a regime of our own. And what's that going to look like? Is it going to be closer to the European model, the American model? Maybe we should learn from the Australians.
Indeed. Well, we would be very happy for you to do that. We certainly got a number of very sharp sticks poked at us about that on a global level, but then a lot of the pundits that were throwing stones at us in the early days did actually sit up and pay attention. And in the long term, here in Australia in general, across the Asia Pacific region, we've had a long-running history of focus on both data privacy and data protection, on which I know you both know, but a lot of our audience may not be fully aware with. So much so that we are considered on par with folk like Germany, for example. A lot of people listening to the show may be well and truly aware that on a global basis, the likes of the German government has for decades been famous specifically around data locality, the local hosting of data systems, and government systems and controls around access of data. And you may not be aware that, but Australia has for decades as well also had a very, very similar focus on data protection and privacy, with the very same types of controls with where data would be stored for government use, and then of course then informed enterprise use. Excuse me. And as you said, very few people have probably not already heard about the recent high-profile challenges that Australia took to courts on a very global scale. A lot of the Silicon Valley unicorns, and particularly in the social media publishing space, the Australian government actually took them to task and brought about some significant changes on how those organisations are allowed to act within Australia, and specifically around the area of publishing news content and articles initially. But as you said, Bill, around the treatment of that data and what data they're allowed to collect, how they use it, the treatment of the data, who's allowed to get access to it. It's one thing for one platform to get access to it, but then are they allowed to feed that data to advertising partners? Are those advertising partners allowed to share it with their advert buyers? If I go to a platform and buy adverts, am I allowed to see some of the data that goes into a social media platform from the users and vice versa, and particularly inside Australia? And we could talk all day on that topic, but Nigel, I understand you're about to embark on a project to work with business systems and technology resellers and integrators around this very space. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, because of the number of stakeholders in a business, you've got legal teams, the legal counsel, you've got sales, marketing, you've got the folks who design and develop the products, and what's going to be sold. Because of those stakeholders, and then there's the fear of the regulation and breaching the regulations. And a lot of organizations actually get frozen. And it's a big beef of mine. A lot of the government commentators, particularly in the UK, that want to reduce the regulation, say, oh, it's stifling innovation. And actually, the biggest stifler of that innovation is knowledge about how to properly use data, what's legal, what isn't, maybe what you can get away with in some circumstances. And there's just a lot of confusion there. So if a reseller talks to a vendor, and they both get leads for products or services or whatever, and often they push those on, and they've spent a lot of money to get hold of some of these this data, in a good way, in a proper legal way, and then people don't do anything with it because they're scared. Can I have this? Is this transfer okay to do? Am I legally obliged or able to contact these people? So there's a lot of confusion around that. And like I said, there's a lot of things that you can do that won't stifle innovation, and you can stay within the law. You just got to get some of these stakeholders together and decide on what you're going to do as a business. So it's very much along those kind of lines. And I'm a privacy advocate myself, so it's kind of interesting that I'm working in that space because it makes it a lot easier for businesses to do the right thing and show that innovation, and still, everybody wins in that case.
Indeed, and we'll come back to it in a moment. But Bill, I know, with your focus being very much on the likes of business incident response, as well as the regulatory side of things for government, I believe we're about to see some very big news on the regulatory front. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, my focus on business incident response is very much around some of those scenarios where so far we've talked about sort of business as usual, how you treat data. But obviously there are going to be times when the unusual happens, when you lose control of your data, it's hacked, it's whatever. And that is in business incident response, one of the areas I focus on for a lot of clients and helping them in that sort of incident. And they're very welcome to reach out anytime if they're in trouble. But also there is another thing that isn't quite business as usual, is sharing data out of region. And there have been a series of different regulations, and you need regulatory harmony between regions if you're going to trust someone else to hold your data. And GDPR is quite specific about how you treat the data of Europeans. But if we're going to take data from one region to another, let's say from the UK to Europe, there needs to be alignment, or between Europe and America, there needs to be alignment there as well. The big problem has been between Europe and America, where the Europeans have a priority focus on privacy, whereas in America, there's more of a priority put on national security. And there's a great deal of mass surveillance. You may or may not be aware of this. If you're not, then maybe you should be. But there have been some treaties between Europe and America to sort of oversee how data has been handled when transferred between the two. First of all, there was one called Safe Harbor. This was challenged in the European courts and overturned. Then there was Privacy Shield, which was a second attempt, which wasn't actually a lot different. It was a bit like lipstick on a pig. And that was also overturned. And I was helping Max Schrems and the team that were doing that because I felt that the regulation needed to be effectively enforced when it was being very widely abused by the likes of Facebook, who were the subject of the challenge. And since then, there has been a bit of a void without any effective regulation for data transfer between Europe and America, which people may well be surprised by. The rumor is, and the big news is, that they're looking at a third treaty. I don't know if it's going to be Privacy Shield 3 or they're going to call it something completely new, but we're expecting to see something revealed in the next month, or maybe a little earlier or sooner than that. And we're looking forward to seeing this. There will be enormous interest, enormous scrutiny. And if they're just attempting to put lipstick on the pig again, it will be challenged and overturned. So it needs to be substantially different. It needs to have the meaningful protections that we require. And we wait to see.
Yeah, in fact, I'll come back to you on that in a moment because I'd like to delve into that a little more, but I'm going to throw it back to you, Nigel, in a moment just for the enterprise take on it. But it's interesting that we're now going to end up potentially, as you said, with a Data Shield 3.0, which then I guess will hopefully support a Web 3.0, which I'm just trying to get my head around. I know, you know, when we saw the data shield come out and we had all kinds of variants, and I remember the Swiss wanted their own version, and then all of a sudden we saw California come up with their own version completely independent, which is state related, and we had all kinds of challenges. Nigel, in the enterprise space, you know, there's I guess an ecosystem inside organizations where they can control the data within their, you know, firewalls, if you like, or their four walls. But then outside that, you know, with your work around partners and integrators and so forth, you're endeavoring on now, you obviously have a broader ecosystem that is between vendors and their partners integrators, and then of course the customers down the line through the whole supply chain. One of the big challenges that I'm keen to get your thoughts on is sort of the cultural challenges that go with that, as Bill just touched on, and I'll come back to you, Bill, in that moment for your take on it. But when we think about that cultural shift that goes from, say, Europe or the UK or EMEA or Asia Pacific, Australia, New Zealand, and particularly US, how does that play out in an enterprise space where organizations are trying to figure out what they do with their UK office versus their Asia Pac office or their US offices? How should organizations be thinking about that cultural challenge of, you know, as Bill said, you know, maybe a national defense focus in the US versus a citizen level control in Europe?
Yeah, you know, it's one of those scary things. I've worked with a lot of businesses in the past that have, you know, a lot of trade secrets, IP that they're really concerned about, and organizations like that for a long time, not just over the last few years, I'm talking 10, 20 years, since we've had, you know, cloud and international transfers of data, that they've been really careful about where they put things, public cloud especially, because they don't see it as secure. I know one organization that I've worked with had different customers in the US that they had in Europe, and they wouldn't even allow the two to mix, even though inside the same company, even though it was the same customers. So they would keep data, US data in the US, European data in Europe. The thing is, though, most other organizations that don't feel they have that level of IP, a lot of them just don't care. You take things like Google Drive and Office 365 or Microsoft 365 as it's called now, and they just use it that individuals collect personal data. They do because they have to do it through their job, and they just put it into their OneDrive or whatever it is. And a lot of cases, they just don't care. Now, the crown jewels potentially, you know, their CRM system, whatever, they'll probably look after that. But there's a lot of data out there that just isn't dealt with in the way that it should be. And that's because we've got these international tech giants that Bill mentioned earlier, and they tend to be the things that these companies gravitate to because it's easy. They're there, they can just be installed, they've got broad capabilities. And if you have to look for a smaller local supplier to do those kind of things, it tends to be a little bit harder, and the integrations maybe not there with some of the other things that you use. So it is a bit of a big mess. It's a difficult thing to deal with. I'm hoping that whatever the lipstick comes on this new privacy pig that we've got internationally, that it solves some of these issues and makes it easier for organizations to deal with. I have to say, though, over the last few years, I see a lot more organizations that are more concerned about keeping things within Europe and not having any transfers. And of course, I'm sure Bill's going to mention this, but even if you deal with Microsoft in Europe, the US Cloud Act means that they can still come get that data. So, you know, you do really have to think carefully about where you put your data from a privacy and data international transfer perspective.
I'm going to come back to you on that in a minute, because I know there's a bunch of CEOs who probably just fainted hearing some of that in the view that they believe they've got a very strong focus on it, and yet they're learning now operationally. I guess it's not so much that recalcitrant staff don't care, it's just they cannot afford to care because they've got a job to do. So I'll come back to you in a second on that, because I think there's a couple of key takeaways that I want to just clarify. But Bill, on the same thing, culturally, when we think about this challenge, not just in government, but when we think about what you're talking about there with regard to the challenge between the likes of the data privacy shield thing originally, and then of course we had the Swiss variant and others, and then of course California came out with their version domestically just at a state level, which created all kinds of ripples. How should organizations in particular approach this cultural challenge of the different take or the different view or the different opinion in many ways on how data should be protected and where privacy should be drawn?
One of the problems that we have is any organization wanting to comply is possibly going to be put in an almost impossible position, because if you want to apply to GDPR and you want to sort of be compliant with this very important regulation, then there are a set of responsibilities that you need to abide by. But at the same time, you and those hosting your data need to abide by the laws in the US. The unfortunate reality is that some of the laws that exist in the US are not only extraterritorial in nature, but are somewhat subversive. It will come as possibly a shock to some that there are laws such as FISA, there's an executive order as well defining sort of surveillance, and there's also a law called the Cloud Act. Collectively, these mean that any electronic communications service provider with a presence in the US, and that would include all cloud firms, all SaaS firms, all social media firms, all telcos, not only all the American ones, but any European ones which actually have an operation in the US because they're subject to US law if they do have a presence there. All of these have to abide by a set of laws which have extraterritorial reach. And this means that the NSA or whoever can tap into the data using FISA warrants, which are secret warrants. So you don't know if your data has been the subject of mass surveillance, and you don't have an effective form of redress if this does happen. And this applies not just to the data that these organizations hold in America, it also applies to any data they hold outside the country, including in Europe. So if you have data with any large organization with an operational presence in the US, and that includes all the cloud firms, all the social media firms, or whoever, that even if that data has been given some sort of data residency and they've offered to keep it in Europe, it's kind of irrelevant because it is subject to these laws, these extraterritorial laws that exist in the US. And what we're looking for from Privacy Shield 3 is that it just doesn't just brush over these issues, which are fundamental incompatibilities between America and US law, and that they find a way of introducing some form of effective redress so that we have not only the protection that we have as a right here in Europe under GDPR, but if the US need to do this sort of mass surveillance and they're abusing our data, then we have some form of effective redress. Now, that is the situation in terms of the cultural issues between the different countries and the laws that apply in each country. But another thing that I would draw to your attention is actually the cultural issues within an organization. What I mean here is that if you look at any organization, whether you're talking about the people on the ground, the middle management, the senior management, or even the members of the board, almost all of them have a performance review of some kind or other. And within that performance review, and I would bet that we've all been there, we've all had that sort of experience, you will potentially be subject to certain ROI measures which measure your personal performance or the performance of your organization. And these tend to be ROI factors such as revenue or profit. So if your business unit has a particularly successful year, its revenue will be high, its profit will be high, it'll get ticks in the box, everyone will get their bonus, and that's the way that organizations operate. That's the way that they're motivated and incented. Unfortunately, there should be three metrics here. It shouldn't just be revenue and profit. It should also be risk. Not enough organizations have a risk orientation. Not enough people within those organizations actually have any kind of metric. What we need is a balance between ROI measurements, which are pervasive throughout organizations and the way they operate, and an ROR measurement, so return on risk. About the only person in large organizations that has a sort of ROR, return on risk orientation, is the CISO, the guy who's actually responsible for the data. And if his incentivization and if his orientation is totally at odds with every other senior executive, every other member of the board, if he even has a seat on the board, then he is going to struggle to actually make a case for privacy and security within those organizations. And culturally, they're not going to be well positioned. And we've seen what happens when this sort of cultural ignorance of risk is allowed to be pervasive, because it's happened before in many different areas. We saw this in the financial collapse when the big banks had people, all of their traders, all of their executives were incented about revenue and profit, and none of them had a measure in terms of risk, apart from the risk management guys in the basement who were ignored anyway. And this led the banks to have a calamitous disaster. We've seen it with the health pandemic, where certain people were raising the alarm and they were ignored, and we had a pandemic. We're living through it at the moment. We're seeing it with climate change. But I think one of the big threats on the horizon for all of us, and I think we realize this, and hopefully the audience does as well, is cybersecurity, the cyber threat. And we're not going to be able to address it effectively if culturally we continue to be entirely ROI focused. That continues to be the way that individually and collectively our measurements, our incentives, and our performance is assessed, and that needs to change.
A good point. I mean, there are a number of stories that get swept under the rug, but they've been in mainstream media around some of the things you spoke about there. Examples of where one nation might route data out of another nation via a third-party nation into a data center they've got control of, so that that's essentially under their legal jurisdiction, and they can treat the data in ways that they can within their nation, even though it's not within their international borders, and then put it back in the country they got it from. And there was an anecdote that made the media all about one nation routing data out of another into Iceland and back, because they had a base there. And when it hit the media, it didn't go well for the organizations in the country doing that. But just staying on that cultural thing, I mean, Nigel, you spoke about some of the challenges that people face around the treatment of data, and often I think it's related to the tools that are available. When CEOs implement a strategic direction or a roadmap that they're going to try and apply to your organization, I think a lot of organizations are trying to stay ahead of this challenge, but many of them, as Bill is alluding to a couple of times there, are caught on the back foot having to respond to incidences and deal with incidences. But with your work in enterprise, and certainly what you're about to embark on with some of the new projects you're consulting on, how do you approach that topic of letting people know they need to get ahead of this? They need to plan before they have an incident. They don't want to deal with it only when they find out they're on the front page of a newspaper. How do CEOs go from an ideal scenario of this is what we'd like to do with our data inside our organization and our data-driven decision-making, down to what data have we got, where is it, and how do we treat it? To that point where you said, well, everyone shares a common cloud drive, and that may or may not reside in the nation. And if we're moving stuff in and out of that cloud drive, does that person using it down at the front desk know that they're moving it into a place that may not be in the country? How do you even advise people to start that conversation around discovering the risks they have, the compliance they need to deal with in country, even in state in some places like America, and certainly Australia, down to their own operational challenges? How do they face that? What are some of the conversations you have with them? How do you start that conversation? And what are the key steps you advise them to take on, given that's a lot of what your current remit and focus is?
Yeah, there's the sad fact of the matter is you have to get their attention first. And to do that, you have to scare the hell out of them. So a lot of the things that Bill just spoke about, the risk elements, not every business still understands what they are. Ransomware has created a big noise, but what's getting scary about ransomware now is double extraction. Again, I've blogged about this on ELNION as well. But if you get hit by ransomware now, there's a good chance, because they've had access to your systems to do that encryption and stop your systems from working, they've also had time to exfiltrate data. There's a story just here in the UK this week, one of our largest snack firms, which is clearly important to everybody. They've got a load of their data already on the dark web. So straight away, and they're unable to fulfill orders. So their business is effectively stopped. Now, the big deal there is the business is stopped. So you think, that's the first key point, but it is only the first. The next one is brand damage. Now I don't think they've got a lot of personal data unless they know intimate details of my late night snacking. that it could embarrass me. But again, depending on the kind of business you're in, that could be bad news. And then, of course, all of the big fines for GDPR come about because of data leaks and data breaches where there's been material harm to individuals. And, again, it doesn't stop there. And I know this is a big thing for Bill too, but then you can get class action lawsuits come around, which can dwarf any of the fines that you'll get for GDPR. So you can have an unfortunate series of events, let's say, just because you've been breached or you've had an issue. Now, the only way to fix this is going back to, I don't know if any of you remember out there, the ITIL kind of approach of people, process, and technology. You have to change all of those things. So there's a lot of education needed for the staff to teach them about the risks and about data protection. Then, of course, you've got to put in the appropriate technologies from a security standpoint, but also from a management standpoint. And then you've got to change your process. One of the scariest discussions I ever have is they go into a business and we're collecting this data and that data. And I said, why are you collecting that data? Do you need it? We're collecting it because we always did. And that could be really sensitive data that they don't actually need. And there's lots of ways to not just encrypt data, but anonymize it, tokenize it, differential marketing technologies that enable you to not know who anybody is. And if you're doing those kind of things, you're going to stay a lot safer. So yeah, you do have to start with the fear factor, but once people understand and they can see that they can actually not just be compliant with all this and de-risk their business, but they can also do some really cool data-driven things down the line. So yeah, those are the kind of conversations we have regularly.
Indeed. And in your past, you worked for an organization like Commvault, where that was the core business. I've recently interviewed one of the tech evangelists at Cloudsphere, and their focus is around exactly that, helping organizations find where their digital assets are, and specifically in cloud environments, because what they found was there was an urgent need for organizations to not only discover their digital assets, but to be able to classify them, tag them. And in my case, I was very interested to learn how they then put a value on them, turn them into an asset, put them on the balance sheet, put some KPIs on them, threw some milestones at them and treated them like an asset and gained some value from them. Or as you said, wrote them off and got rid of them. And no point in managing an asset if you don't need it. It just starts costing you money.
Absolutely,
well, gentlemen.
Yes. Sorry, I was just going to say,
and
one of the big deals is most organizations now, from mid-size all the way up to large enterprise, they just have too much data. You can't manage all of that manually. Like you said, you've got to tag it, understand it, and then you know what, you'll find data that you can use. So yeah, I completely
Indeed.
agree.
Yeah, there's I forget his name now, is Andrew Wright, the famous Australian, very dry, witty American comedian that says, you can't have everything. Where would you put it? Well, gentlemen, it's been fantastic to chat about this big topic. We will definitely have an ongoing series of these for our very, very information-hungry audiences, particularly the CEOs and C-suite around it. To wrap us up, I wonder if I can just do a quick round robin with both of you for a couple of key takeaways. Nigel, let me just stay with you, and then I'll come to you, Bill. Nigel, in light of what we discussed today, and certainly what you've just outlined a moment ago, what, in your view, should business and technology decision makers from the CEO down be focusing on over the next 12 to 18 months in this space of data protection, and particularly in the scope of enterprise data protection, your key focus?
Yeah, well, for me, you've got to keep an eye to regulation. As Bill's pointed out, that's going to change. Every organization's risk profile is different. Some don't carry a lot of personal data. Some don't have a lot of IP. So you need to look into all of those things and understand your data profiles. And then only when you understand that can you make some decisions. I would generally say most organizations aren't doing enough. And as a privacy advocate, I just want to say to everybody who's in this kind of field or is looking to change their business, then you don't have to abuse people's privacy to have a good business. And if you do, then maybe you should think about the fact that you don't really have a business.
Well, that's a really great point. Actually, it's something that's come up recently in a conversation to a CEO forum that I host monthly and quarterly, and that question was, now in the last 2 years, we've been given the opportunity to have a think about what kind of business are we, how are we operating, and particularly around treatment of our staff and the work remote sort of thing, and why are we desperately trying to get them back into offices? And a lot of times it's because we've got big sunk costs in the form of real estate that's costing us money, and shareholders aren't happy about it, or investors aren't happy about it. and they're asking us to either get it off the books or fill it up with people. And of course, then you have to ask the question, well, that's all well and good for that point of view, but what about the humans and people? So yeah, I think that's a great point to leave us on with regard to data. Bill, again, in light of what we discussed today, what in your view should key business and technology decision makers in the government realm be focusing on the next 12 to 18 months in the space of data protection?
One of the things that we need to focus on is the big news I mentioned earlier, because that's going to change the landscape. The data sharing apparatus and agreements between Europe and America are fundamental to a lot of our trade. But we need adequacy between more different regions, and the UK needs to be able to trade with both of those blocks. So there is an emphasis on the governments to get that sorted so that it can make it harmonious, and also to ensure that there's enforcement so that these regulations are effective and that the protections are meaningful. For the organizations out there that are combating the threats and seeking to be compliant, I would, from a very high level, say that there are plenty of tools out there that you can use. They're very effective tools, not only for encryption and backup that Nigel mentioned earlier, but also for protection and detection. Sometimes the challenges are not the availability of the tools, it's actually integrating them, managing them and making them work. And I suspect that some CISOs out there are spending almost more time trying to operate a whole suite of point solutions and integrate them, more time on that than they are actually dealing with the threats. So that's to be aware of. And also when it comes to detection, there are some ways in which you can have so many false positives, so many potential alarms that it's almost impossible to deal with them. So in this automated environment, we need the intelligence to manage that effectively. When it comes through to the incident response side, which is where I really focus, there is actually far more of a challenge. This needs to be addressed firstly with a technical team to go in and fix stuff to deal with the problem that you've had, whether you've been hacked or whatever. And if you can deal with that effectively, that's the first step. It provides the forensics that you then need to best base the rest of your strategy on. And there are plenty of organizations actually that do that, and that part of the market is well served. You then need to take that forensics part onto a legal team. And Nigel mentioned that the potential for litigation is possibly the biggest potential cost here. And you need to be aware, so that you need to take the technical forensics and turn it into a legally defensible narrative. Now, this part of the market is reasonably well served. There's more and more legal capability in law and data law and privacy law, but most of it is focused on the things like GDPR. They're not actually well set up to support you in a cyber incident. So just be very careful and focus on the really skilled people that are going to save your backside. And that legally defensible narrative needs to be turned into a brand defense plan, because as Nigel mentioned with that snack food company, they're facing massive reputational damage. Unfortunately, this part of the market is very poorly served. Generic incident response firms will take the wrong approach to dealing with a cyber incident, because a cyber incident needs a totally different approach and a different handling. And that's what me and my team do. And hopefully, if you find yourself in that situation, you can reach out to us and we can do something for you. But finally, there's the whole social media side of things. You're going to face a massive amount of misinformation and hysteria on social media. And at that point, you're going to need, your own credibility is going to be an all-time low. You're going to need people to step in as trusted voices to actually put things right, to help defend you, because nobody will believe what you're saying. And at that point in time, again, there are some major figures on social media. Some of the guys in this particular room are able to help in that particular respect. And I think you need to think about that whole gambit. It's not just protection and detection. You need to be ready for when things go wrong. And if you think it's not going to happen to you, I think you're sitting on a level of false security.
Indeed, and you may be due for a nasty shock. And some great key takeaways and certainly actionable things that I think our audience should be very, very seriously taking notes of. I'm going to wrap us up on a couple of key points that I regularly share with people, and that is, number one, stick to your core business. If you're a bank or an airline, be the best bank or the best airline you can be. Don't pretend you're a cybersecurity expert. Don't pretend that you're a regulatory compliance expert. Bring in the best people you can afford to advise you and help you and support you through that journey. The second piece of advice I want to leave people with is it's okay to start with a clean sheet of paper. Sometimes it's okay to literally just grab a pen and paper or sit in a boardroom with a whiteboard marker and start to map out what you do know and put circles around the things that you don't know, and then find partners who can help you fill in those gaps and find those unknowns, those Donald Rumsfelds of the known knowns that you know yourself, the known unknowns that you're aware of, but need to go and get some specialist help like the gentleman we've been talking to today to help you with. And also the unknown unknowns. There are things that you just don't know, and that's some of the scary stuff we're figuring out. You know, as Nigel said, what assets have you got out there and who's using them, or why you're collecting the data, and as Bill said, what rules do you have to comply with, and what rules do you not know that you've got to comply with. So the two things I generally advise people on is stick to your core strengths and focus on your own business, and bring in experts who can help you in areas like cybersecurity and data protection and data backup and things like that. And then start with a clean sheet of paper sometimes and play the role backwards, and even role play that process too. You know, what would happen if we had an incident? Who do we call? What do we do? And I think, you know, a very timely opportunity to remind people that that has happened to us in the last 2 years. As Bill said, you know, we should have seen the pandemic coming for the whole world. It was very clearly coming out of a region, and it was on the front page of every newspaper. It was on every radio show, every TV show, and yet people waited for it to hit them. And almost no organizations had a plan to deal with the pandemic hitting them. And then one day, on a Tuesday, a lot of companies in certain regions said, don't come to work. You know, there was no role playing, no scenarios, no planning. The DR plan, the business continuity plan got dusted off, and most of them didn't work. So stick to your core business and be good at that. Bring in specialist partners, role play, and sometimes white sheet the exercise and figure out what you do and don't know. In the meantime, Nigel Tozer, great to see you. Thanks so much for joining us. Bill Mew, always great to see you, have you on the show. We will have you both back again to continue the conversation, and maybe we'll get a bit deeper in the weeds around some of these things for the next in the series. And thank you everyone for joining us today to be part of this conversation. We would like you after this to do two things. Share it with your colleagues and associates, either around your network of professionals or associates and at work. Make sure you can help them start the conversation. And secondly, join the conversation on social media. So follow Nigel and Bill and myself on LinkedIn. Reach out, connect if you feel inclined to bring questions to us. Follow us on Twitter. We're all actively tweeting away our thoughts and opinions there. And certainly delve into some of the articles that likes of Bill and Nigel and myself are writing on a regular basis, particularly on ELNION.com. In the meantime, Nigel, Bill, stay well. Thanks for your time. And folks, we will see you again in the next in the series. I'm Des Blanchfield. We really appreciate your time. Take care.